Hello and good afternoon. It's Good Friday, and this afternoon we're going to take a brief lesson on what this day means to us and what Jesus went through on this day so many years ago. And it's the time of year that we study this lesson a lot. We study the crucifixion and what Jesus went through quite a bit as a church, as a body of believers. And if we're not careful, it can be something that we gloss over sometimes. And we don't mean to do it, we don't intend to do it, but if we're honest with ourselves, we do it. And today I want this to be far more than just another lesson. I want it to be far more than just another moment in our lives that we say, yeah, this happened, and we gloss over it and we move on. Because this is a pivotal moment in human history. This is a pivotal moment in our history as believers. It's a pivotal moment in the history of redemption story. And this is the culmination of all those things. And I don't want it to be just another story to us. I don't want it to be just another thing we hear about and we move on with life. I want it to impact us. And my prayer today is that it would impact you, that you would realize the scope of God's love, that you would realize why He did it, and that this would be more than a story to you today. So we're going to take a look at the crucifixion and what Jesus went through. Before we get there, those of you who sit through my Sunday school classes know I like to give a little background, a little history. And the first known crucifixions happened somewhere between 400 and 300 BC. And they were first done by the Persians. And when Alexander the Great was conquering his lands and he was fighting against Persia, he sees this method of execution happening in Persia. And he brings it back with him to Egypt and to Carthage, and he institutes this method of execution. Much later on, when the Romans are conquering the known world at the time, and they invade Egypt and they invade Carthage, they see this method of execution happening, and they bring it back with them to Rome. And it's here that they perfect it. They perfect the brutal execution that is crucifixion. And they make it into what we know today. And so our story, though, begins in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus has already had his Last Supper with his disciples. And Judas has gone off to talk to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time. And Judas sells Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, which was about the price of a slave in those days. And he goes and betrays Jesus. And Jesus is in the garden as he's been much of the night. And his disciples are there with him, and they keep falling asleep on him, and he continues to go back and to wake them up. And Jesus prays several times in the garden for this cup to pass from him. And we see in Luke how much anguish he's really in. We see in Luke 22:44, it says this: "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling to the ground." It's not surprising that sweating blood would be something that piques Luke's interest. Luke was a doctor, and this was a rare medical phenomenon. Something called hematidrosis. It's where the capillaries burst, that are the capillaries that are feeding the blood, the sweat glands. They burst, and the blood mixes with the sweat, and the person begins to literally sweat blood. And when this happens, the person becomes far more dehydrated than normal. We all sweat different, right? But when we sweat, we lose fluid we need. It's why we drink water, it's why we drink Gatorade, it's why we try to replenish our body with electrolytes. But here, Jesus is not only sweating, but he's sweating blood, so he's losing both fluids. And this is leaving him mild to moderately dehydrated. And it runs the risk in the cool air of putting him in shock also. And so it's during this point that the guards come. Judas betrays Jesus, and Jesus is given over to the temple guards. Along the way, Jesus is blindfolded. He's struck repeatedly. His beard's tugged on. He's spat upon. He's mocked. All this before he ever stands trial. And so we see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record these events. Matthew 26 says, "They did spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee?" So it's early morning, and Jesus is already battered and bruised and dehydrated, exhausted from lack of sleep. And he's questioned by Caiaphas, by the Sanhedrin. And ultimately they don't get the answers they want to hear. And so they take him, first thing they can, to Pilate, who's the local governor of Jerusalem at the time. And Pilate briefly questions Jesus, and he was brought there on reason of being treasonous against Rome. And so Pilate questions him. And when he can't find anything wrong with him, and he finds out that he's from Galilee, he sends him to Herod Antipas. So Jesus is shuttled over to Herod's place, where he's questioned again. And Herod ultimately doesn't get any answers he wants from him. So he sends him back to Pilate. So already Jesus is dehydrated, beaten, being mocked several times and being shuffled back and forth all across this land. And so after getting back in front of Pilate, Pilate tells the people that he's found nothing wrong with this man, that he can't find anything wrong with Jesus, that he has no reason to punish him. And there was a custom in that day, that right before Passover, which was a pretty holy day for the Jewish people, right before Passover, Pilate would offer up a prisoner to be released back unto the people as kind of a favor of goodwill. And so he offers up a choice. They can have Jesus, or they can have Barabbas. And Pilate says to Jesus, I've found no fault in him. Barabbas is a known murderer. The people cry out for Barabbas instead of Jesus. They'd rather have the murderer than Jesus given back to them. That's a whole nother lesson for another day that we could get into. So Pilate takes Jesus and he has him scourged. He has him beaten. Now, in scourging or being beaten, there's two different laws you could look at. Under Jewish law, it was believed that anything over 40 stripes would kill a person. And so typically a punishment, if somebody was to be beaten, was usually 40 stripes minus one. And that was in case somebody miscounted or they didn't want the person on the verge of death. However, this is a Roman punishment, and the Romans have no such limit. The Romans are using an instrument called the flagrum to do their scourging. And during a scourging, Jesus' arms would be shackled above his head. And this keeps the back taut. This keeps the skin tight. And as they begin to beat them, it would cause more pain, do more damage. And so the flagrum that they're using is a leather whip with several leather strips on the end of it. And on the end of each of those strips, there's a couple different things. Could be pieces of bone, could be lead balls, could be other debris, something sharp, a little piece of iron. And they begin to whip him. They begin to strike him. And at first, the leather strips, they cut into the skin. But as the whipping continues, the strips cut deeper and deeper into the subcutaneous tissue, into the muscles, and blood starts to flow out. The lead balls are causing bruising, and eventually that bruising is rupturing, and blood is pouring out of the wounds. The pieces of bone, the debris, they're cutting the back into ribbons of flesh. By the time they're done, his back is unrecognizable. It's just hanging there by ribbons. It's tattered. It's awful. And so they take him, and the guards, thinking this is some great joke, because they're supposed to be doing this to a king. They decide to give a king a crown. And so they find what they can around them that would cause pain and mock him. And they find a juju plant. And juju plants have these long thorns, about that long. And so they fashion a crown out of this juju plant, these vines, and they wrap it around, and they place it on his head. And not only do they place it on his head, but then they strike him with a stick, and that drives the thorns deep into his skull and causes blood to flow out where there's excessive blood anyway right now. And so not only do they do that, but they decide the king needs a robe too. And so they take a piece of cloth and they put it on his back. And because the wounds are so great, because his skin is in the shape it is, the cloth, the robe, if you will, would have almost instantly adhered to his back. The blood and the serum would have been like an adhesive to this cloth. It would have quite literally been stuck to his back. And so they mock him, they spit on him, they strike him. And when they're done, they decide to rip this robe off his back, this cloth off his back. And when they do that, it would be reopening every single wound. It'd be like he was hit all over again. And so they do this, and they take him before Pilate, this unrecognizable mess of a man. They take him before Pilate. And Pilate presents him to the people, and he tells them once again that he's found no fault with them. What do you want me to do with this man? And the crowd shouts out, "Crucify him." And the animosity is so great that Pilate kind of fears an uprising here. And in order to not provoke an uprising, he decides to do what the people are asking of him. He decides to crucify him. And so when it comes to crucifixion, there's two parts of the cross. There's the stipes, which is the vertical member. And that was already at Golgotha's Hill. It's more economical to have the instrument of death in one place and to change the replaceable parts out. And so the replaceable part, the horizontal member, it's called the patibulum. This was a rough log that the person would be fastened to ultimately, and it would be put in place once he got to the cross. And so Jesus is supposed to carry this patibulum all the way to Golgotha's Hill. Well, the patibulum is 110 pounds of rough cut log. It's splinters. It's not neat in any way. And he's got to carry it on his raw back to Golgotha's Hill, which estimates say is about 650 yards from the gates of where Pilate is. 6.5 football fields. That Jesus has to carry 110 pounds, battered, bruised, disoriented, dehydrated, sleepless. He's got to carry this all the way up this hill, 650 yards. It's no wonder he stumbles along the way. It's no wonder that they've got to get a man named Simon of Cyrene to help him carry the cross the rest of the way. And so they get Jesus to Golgotha's Hill. And they begin to affix him to the cross. Now, when you're nailing somebody to a cross, you're using wrought iron nails. These are not smooth by any means. These have one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to hold a person to an instrument of death. And so these rough pieces of iron that are probably used over and over again are being nailed into Jesus. And now there's a couple different methods of hanging somebody on the cross. You probably have seen the nail driven in the hand, and while that was a method, right, it would also mean that you'd have to rope the person's arm to the patibulum also, or else there's nothing there in the metatarsal bones to be weight-bearing. That can't hold a person's weight in and of itself. You'd also have to rope somebody's arms along with that. That was one method that they used. Another method was, if you want full brutality, you drive the nail between the radius and the ulna, and that is a weight-bearing surface, and then the person hangs a little deeper than if they were roped up. And when they hang deeper, it causes suffocation all the more. It causes the asphyxiation that happens all the more. It's a more brutal way to do it. And so when you pierce the hand, you pierce the median nerve, and the median nerve runs up the arm into the back of the shoulder and then up through the neck. And this is a nerve many of us are probably familiar with if we've ever bumped our funny bone. And so as that nerve is pierced, Jesus moves. He feels like he's bumped his funny bone constantly. He feels that pain all the time. The next part they would do is they would nail the person's feet, and they would overlap the feet, and they would drive a nail through the metatarsal bones of the feet right below the ankle. And that would be enough to bear the weight downward as they hung. And this would cause Jesus to have to work if he wanted to breathe. So as he's hanging there, his pectoral muscles are immobilized. His intercostal muscles, they're immobilized. He can hang, and he's hanging down. He can draw air in, but he can't exhale it. If he wants to exhale it, he has to pick himself up to breathe out. If he wants to talk, he has to pick himself up to breathe out. And every time he does that, he's reactivating the pain in these nerves. When they drive the nail into the feet, it's piercing the medial nerve, and the medial nerve is connected to the tibial nerve, which is connected to the sciatic nerve. And if you've ever had a really bad Charlie horse, you know how this feels. If you've ever had lower back pain, you know how this feels. And so Jesus, every time he tries to gasp for air, every time he tries to breathe, every time he tries to exhale, he reignites those nerves, he reignites all that pain. And he has a very difficult time doing that. So difficult, in fact, that he only speaks about 7 times while he's on the cross. And so he's now crucified. He's experiencing wave after wave of pain from the nails. Every time he's got to work to take a breath, the splinters are in his back, which is raw. He's starting, because he can't exhale, he can't get rid of the carbon dioxide. Because he can't get rid of the carbon dioxide, he's using up all of the oxygen. He's starting to suffer from carbon dioxide poisoning. And this poisoning can lead to dizziness, can lead to nausea, it can lead to a headache, it can lead to rapid breathing, which he can't do. It can lead to an elevated heart rate, which is another problem. It can lead to convulsions and loss of consciousness. And the elevated heart rate is a problem in itself, because his heart is already working overtime. All the wounds that he's suffering from, his heart's working overtime to produce more blood to the wounds so that the body can start to heal. But there's so many wounds, the heart's already elevated. And now, as he's suffering from asphyxiation, as he's suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning, his heart is pumping all the harder. And his blood begins to thicken. And when his blood thickens, the heart has to work even harder to pump the blood out through his body. And this is the constant cycle he's going through. Pain, carbon dioxide poisoning, numbing enough so he can pick himself up, get an exhale, draw in the next breath, and then the cycle starts all over again. As he's hanging there, a new pain starts to happen. It happens deep within his chest. And his heart's working so hard. His blood is so thick that fluid begins to build up around the pericardium. The pericardium is a sac that encases your heart. People that have congestive heart failure know this. or have experienced somebody in their family that has congestive heart failure, knows about the fluid around the heart. And that's what's happening here. The fluid is building up around his heart, and it's causing deep chest pains, and it's nearly over now. And with his fluid loss at extremes, and his heart struggling to pump blood, and the asphyxiation setting in, he mutters his final two phrases. He says, "It is finished. And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And with that, Jesus breathes his last, and his mission on earth here is over. The rest of the story, as some of you may know, is that in order to not profane the Sabbath day, because it was Passover, it was a holy day for the Jewish people. In order to not profane that day, the soldiers were ordered to break the legs of all those that were being crucified. And Jesus was being crucified with two other thieves. And they break the legs of the thieves, and when they get to Jesus, they notice that he's already dead. And to make sure that he is dead, they take a spear, and they drive it between the ribs through the fifth interspace into the heart. And they pull it out, and it's here in John 19:34 that we see our cause of death. It says, "But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water." Jesus died of pericardial effusion, which is fluid around the heart, that led to heart failure. Or, to put it quite literally, Jesus died of a broken heart. So why? Why did he go through all this? We see this curious passage in Romans 12:2. It says this. It says, "Looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God." Who for the joy that was set before him. What joy is there in what he went through? What joy could there possibly be? We heard the story. We heard the medical synopsis of what happened here. What joy is there in that death? Well, there is one. That joy that was set before Jesus is you. It's the hope of a relationship with you. The reason Jesus went through all of this stuff is so that you could be with him, to give you redemption. It's why he said, "It is finished." He wants to give us redemption. He wants to give us hope. Jeremiah 1:5 says this, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before you camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." He knew us before we were born. He knew who we would become. He knew our thoughts. He knew our hopes, our dreams. He knew our successes. And he knew our failures. Before we were ever a glimpse in anybody's eye, he knew those things. And it was joy that was set before him as he's in the garden sweating those great drops of blood, as he's in that physical anguish. The thing that carried him to the next step was you. The hope of being with you. Jeremiah 29:11 says this, "For I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." As he stitched your muscles and tendons together, as he hewed your bones out of nothing, he had plans for you. He knew what you would become, and he knew what he wanted from day one. He wanted you. Romans 5:8 tells us this. "But God commended his love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." You see, he didn't love you at your best. It's easy to love people when they're at their best sometimes. It's a whole lot harder to love people when they are at their worst. And he loves us at our worst. He loved us while we were yet sinners. He died for us. He said, I know your deepest fears. I know your deepest failures. I know your worst moments when you don't feel all that lovable. And I still think they're worthy of love. I still think that you are worthy of love. That's what he did for you and for I. John 3:16 says, For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. He did this because he knew no matter how hard you tried, no matter how good you tried to be, he knew it wouldn't be enough. He knew that you could never pay the debt that sin has given you. And he knew that something had to pay the price, or else you'd be wiped out. And so he paid the price for you. He paid the price for me. He paid the price for us to give us everlasting life. Who else loves you that intensely, that passionately, that grandly? It's an incomparable, inescapable, unending, unfailing love that Jesus loves us with. It is this great and intense and burning desire within Jesus to give you redemption, to give you forgiveness, to give you grace. And he offers that to you freely. He offers it to you because you can't do it yourself. He offers it to you because he loves you that much. He loves you that much. He hasn't let you go. He hasn't stopped loving you, regardless of what you think yourself. If you are hearing these words, he hasn't stopped loving you. He hasn't given up on you. He wants to give you a life, and a life more abundantly in him. The question is that what you want? You see, Jesus not once has ever wavered in his commitment to us. Not once. But yet so many times we waver in our commitment to him. So many times we pick up those things that are useless. So many times we doubt him. So many times we doubt his plan for us and what he's called us to be. But yet, he loves us still. He picks us up in spite of our failures. He brushes us off in spite of our stupidity sometimes. He brushes us off and he forgives us, and he wraps his loving arms around us, and he says, my child, I love you, and you are more than enough for me. And we sometimes make his grace so cheap, but his grace isn't cheap. He loves you with this intense, unfailing love. And he wants you. The question is, do you want him that bad too? What are you going to do with this gift? So why did he go through this? Because of you. Because he cares that much for you. He adores you. He treasures you. He thinks the world of you, and then some. And all he wants is for that love to be returned. All he wants is for that love to be established, that relationship to start. And once it does, all other things melt away. He wants you tonight. And I know that because I've seen it in my own life. You know, I used to think, it was around this time, almost 20 years ago, that I met Jesus for the first time. And at that point in my life, I was a mess. I was an absolute mess of a human being. I was convinced that no one would ever love me. I was convinced that I was beyond love. I was convinced that no one really wanted me. And I heard about Jesus, and I heard about what he did, and I was captivated. I said, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? If he lets me down, it's just another person on my list. What do I have to lose? And so I took a chance. And I asked him into my life. I asked him to forgive me. I asked him to clean me up. And you know what? He has not let me down one day of my life. He hasn't. I'm not perfect by any means. I promise you, I am the farthest thing from perfection. The farthest thing. But yet, he's always been there to pick me up. He's always been there to comfort me. He has always been there to slap me upside the head sometimes and say, Jeremy, you're going the wrong way. You're doing the wrong thing. What is wrong with you? And he's always been there with his loving hand to correct me. He's always been there to guide me into a greater truth. He's always been there to pick me up when I've failed immensely. I have never seen anything so like his love. It's incomparable. It's incomprehensible sometimes. But yet he still loves me. And he loves you that much too. He loves you that fiercely. You don't have to be a slave to your sin anymore. You don't have to be bound up in your addictions. You don't have to be bound up in lust or anger or bitterness or wrath or depression or whatever the thing is that you are fighting in your life. You don't have to be a slave to it anymore. And that is a truth that the devil does not want you to hear. That is the greatest truth in this world. That Jesus wants you to have freedom. And freedom in him. That you don't have to be a slave to your sin anymore. That you don't have to be bound up in that thing anymore. That you can become more than a conqueror in him. And he loves you that much. And he wants that for you. And he believes that you can have it. And he offers it to you. It's like every gift, you've got to make a decision. Do I accept it? Or do I reject it? The choice is yours. So may you, today, may you realize how much Jesus loves you. May you understand the breadth and the scope and the width of his love. May you realize how intensely and fiercely he wants you. And may you come to know him in the power of his resurrection and his redemption. And may you, for the first time in a long time, feel freedom in your life. All you've got to do is ask him for it. To ask him for forgiveness and to live a life that honors him. John 3:30 is my favorite verse. It says, he must increase and I must decrease. The closer we get to Jesus, the more we realize how much we need to be like him. The more we realize that the things that we think are so important in this world just don't matter. And he gives us this new life. He gives us a life that's free in him. And we don't have to be a slave to who we once were. So may you find that peace today. May you find that redemption today. And may you know that you've got a Savior that loves you. And that you can call on his name when you need him. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for today. I thank you for this day and what it means. I thank you for Jesus, your redemptive mission, and that, Lord, you endured the cross for us. I thank you that, Lord Jesus, on that cross, it was finished. I thank you, Lord, that you paid the price for our sins, that you gave us hope in a future when you rose from the dead, and that, Lord Jesus, you can rescue us from our slavery to sin. That, Lord Jesus, you have paid the price for us. And Lord, I ask that today that anyone who hears these words, anyone who hears this message of hope, anyone that hears what you have done for them, I pray that, Lord Jesus, you would speak to them in a way that's unique to their lives and help them to know the fullness of your love for them. Help them to know how great your grace is that's available for them. And Lord Jesus, wrap your loving arms around them and let them know how treasured they are. It's in your name I pray, Jesus. Amen. I love you all. God bless.